Today, you're about to see how was it like to be one of the crews operating the weapon responsible for 30% of all casualties in a war that claimed 20 million lives. You'll hear fascinating and strange details about the machine guns of the time, their combat tactics, and the horrific dangers their crews faced. Let's begin. Machine guns, although used before in smaller engagements, would show their true nature when put into a large-scale conflict, which turned out to be the Great War. Here, alongside artillery, they changed everything. Artillery and machine guns completely transformed the traditional way of warfare of rapid movements and open charges in tight formations. Now, with the capability of sustained rapid fire from a single position, anyone trying this tactic would be quickly mowed down. This would be seen many times during this war, eventually forcing generals to rethink centuries-old tactics. Let's first quickly explain the machine guns used here. You've all heard about the legendary water-cooled Maxim machine gun and its versions, so we're not going to bother you much with that. By the time World War I began, every major power had adopted its own machine guns, such as the German MG-08, the British Vickers, and the French Hotchkiss. While the MG-08 and Vickers were based on the same recoil-operated mechanism developed by Hiram Maxim, the French Hotchkiss used a different gas-operated system, making its design fundamentally distinct. However, their sustained firepower of around 450 to 600 rounds per minute, although revolutionary for the time, came with a cost in weight. Water was used to cool the barrel and allow the gun to continue firing. Water was as important as ammunition, and without it, they couldn't fire for long before destroying the gun. The Vickers machine gun's jacket, for example, held about 1 gallon of water. As the gun fired, the water absorbed heat from the barrel, eventually reaching boiling point and producing steam. A steam tube directed it into a condensing can, allowing some portion of the steam to cool back into water, which could then be reused to refill the jacket. However, in the horrific conditions of trench warfare, maintaining a water supply both for soldiers and machine guns was difficult. In critical situations, when left without water in the heat of battle, soldiers resorted to using their own urine to fill the water jackets so the guns could continue firing. Listen to this example. During the Battle of the Somme, a company of machine gunners was ordered to provide sustained covering fire over a certain position so the Germans couldn't organize a counterattack. Just the catch was that they needed to do that for 12 hours. The order came that every single drop of available water on the front must be provided to the machine gun company, including men's drinking water and even latrine buckets. Over those 12 hours, a company of 10 guns would use up 100 barrels and fire 1 million rounds. However, despite the water cooling system, barrels would eventually wear out after prolonged firing, so the quick barrel change system was also used, often in the heat of battle, where every second you weren't firing, the enemy was getting closer. Let's now explain how one machine gun crew and their position looked like. Being a sensitive and important piece of equipment, it required a specialized and well-trained team to operate it. A crew between 4 and 6 specialists would man one gun. The gunner would be firing, the assistant gunner feeding ammunition and assisting with clearing jams, reloading, etc. Ammunition bearers made sure there was a constant supply of ammo, and in some units, they even had spotters for identifying targets and giving the gunner instructions on when and where he should fire. All crews underwent rigorous training in weapon mastery and drills that would instill reflexes so they would perform their tasks without thinking under the chaos of combat. Fire must be sustained no matter what, jams must be cleared as quickly as possible, and an incapacitated gunner replaced immediately without thinking. These two things were usually the only times the firing was interrupted for a couple of seconds. Imagine being a third gunner in line, waiting to replace the next one who replaced the previous one after being hit. You know that any time he will also get hit, and then it's your turn, and there's a probable chance that someone would replace you in the same way. Some crews experimented with makeshift body armor, double-layered helmets, and gun shields to protect themselves, but they couldn't do much against high-velocity bullets and artillery shells, besides hoping they wouldn't find its way through the firing port. If one gun went silent, it was often a signal for the enemy to swarm the position. They had a much higher casualty rate, although being further back behind the first line. Enemy snipers were even instructed to shoot not just gunners but machine guns as well, as a disabled gun was harder to replace than a fallen operator. And when you forget all dangers to you as a machine gunner and you are lucky to live through the war, you now have to carry memories of mowing down enemy ranks for the rest of your life. One soldier remembers that during an attack, the infantry charge was so massive that he couldn't fire and miss as they cut enemy lines one after the other. Veterans often recalled the eerie quiet after prolonged firing, and the realization that hundreds of lives had been ended in seconds left many machine gunners haunted for years. Because of their weight, in World War I, machine guns were used mostly for defense and breaking charges. They were a huge force multiplier, and they were strategically positioned to maximize their effectiveness, especially on the Western Front where trench warfare was at its peak. Guns were placed in fortified positions overlooking anticipated enemy approaches, and preferably creating interlocking and overlapping fields of fire to create deadly crossfire zones. They worked best when firing along the enemy's line, a tactic called enfilade fire. Guns were placed on the flanks of defensive positions. From there, they could shoot diagonally across the battlefield, covering a wide area and often crossing fire with other guns to make it even deadlier. The crew would pick a target point up to 600 meters away. If the enemy attacked, they would fire at that point, knowing the bullets would hit anyone crossing their path. The gun was set so the bullets didn't cross head height, making it very hard for anyone to get through. This setup made machine guns incredibly effective without needing to adjust aim during the attack. Besides that, they were also used quite effectively in indirect fire, firing in a high arc trying to hit soldiers in cover. Some versions even came with an inclinometer and indirect fire sight. Elevated positions with a clear line of sight were perfect, but the downside was that they were exposed to artillery fire. Crews tried to fortify and camouflage their positions as much as possible, but the cover was up the moment they started firing. Soon after, the majority of the front would focus on them as they were the biggest threat to infantry going over the top and across no man's land. Snipers, infantry rifle fire, enemy machine guns, and artillery all tried to suppress or destroy machine gun positions during the attack. Barbed wire and other obstacles were used to funnel advancing enemy formations to come through narrow sections of the battlefield, and machine gunners would then use this opportunity to cause horrendous casualties. In fact, generals throughout most of the war failed to figure out the right tactic against machine gun positions. They would try to suppress them and send wave after wave of infantry charges, which didn't prove quite well. It wasn't until later in the war when Germans came up with stormtrooper tactics that infantry had a reasonable chance against machine gun nests. Now the job of machine gunners was even more terrifying, as you could expect small and fast, highly trained infantry units to infiltrate your lines and rapidly push towards your position, jumping from cover to cover until they approached and silenced the machine gun position, usually with bombs and bayonets. Later in the war, the need for lighter and portable machine guns was seen so they could also support attacks. The British developed the Lewis gun, weighing around 28 pounds and using an air cooling system instead of water and a drum magazine instead of a belt to stay light and portable. The French introduced the Chauchat, one of the first portable automatic weapons, although it was unreliable in the field. Germany responded with the MG-0815, a modified version of their heavy gun which added a bipod and stock but still needed 2 men to operate effectively. These lighter guns, and even some early submachine guns, allowed soldiers to fire while moving, providing suppressive fire during attacks and giving small units more flexibility and firepower on the battlefield. They would set the stage for air-cooled machine guns that would follow after the war. The German MP-18, for example, could be called the first true submachine gun. Compact, chambered in 9mm pistol cartridge, it was specifically designed for trench warfare and used effectively by German stormtroopers in close combat. So, the machine gun story had just begun in World War I, setting the stage for the next global conflict and new designs that would increase their lethality even further.